interrupt this performance of the Chicago Philharmonic with this bulletin from the WPOD Newswire. Dateline, Chicago. Billibob Baddins is a 4'1" dwarf from the Griffinos Highlands of Acryonis. Sucked through a portal of oblivion, he finds himself in a public library somewhere in Chicago, Illinois, USA. The year is 1929. Educating himself with the thousands of books at his disposal, Billy decides on an occupation in order to earn an honest living. He becomes a private detective. A slow day at Baddins' investigations picks up when socialite Julia Lessinger hires Billy to investigate the death of her gangster boyfriend, Pretty Boy DeMaio. And now you know the story so far. We return to our regularly scheduled programming here on WPOD, Chicago.
Chapter 2. Scene of the Grime. A quiet weekend is a private eye's best friend. There were no special parades or galas planned, the ball team was out of town, and other forms of revel and raucous were either enjoying their current run or getting ready to shut down. Since nothing special was happening in the Windy City, there would be the same number of cops on the streets as usual. And those cops tended to take it slow on the weekends. No one likes to be working on a Saturday when you could be at home with the wife and kids, enjoying a picnic, or huddled around a radio enjoying a morning with a Philharmonic or an afternoon of theater. So while the cops were taking their time walking the beat and the Chicago nightlife types were catching their breath, a dwarf could expect to enjoy a day of honest work without too much hassle. "You work too hard," I could hear Miranda saying just before popping her gum. "Even a guy like you needs to take a break." She never liked it when I worked weekends, and I wouldn't argue with that. I did work hard, even with things as slow as they had been in our office lately. But I needed to turn things around for Baddins' investigations, so my weekend began with the biggest case this little guy ever had cross his desk. Two's a crowd when you're snooping where you're not wanted, so I got this morning started before the early bird sounded its battle cry. The trolley dropped me a few blocks shy of the corner of Kingston and D Street, where Sal's stood. Where it had once stood. Rounding the corner of a brownstone, I couldn't help but just stand there for a moment, taking in the epic scale of this mob hit. All that was left were a few stone pillars and wooden beams, charred by the heat of the fire, but defying the urge to collapse into dust and soot. Maybe it was the ghost of Sal himself keeping the last shreds of his place standing. I don't know if he had paid protection money or not, but whatever his deal was with Capone, it certainly didn't protect him or the few innocents in his place when the bomb went off. So far, my only company this morning were bakers, butchers, and various other tradesmen, sweeping their porches free of the soot and debris that had wandered over from Sal's the night before. They paid no mind to this pile of rubble that had singed the buildings surrounding it, nor did they seem to care about the lives lost. As far as they were concerned, it was a week-old Tribune headline that would soon be replaced by another gang-related incident. Life had to go on. Casting a final glance over my shoulder at the merchants, still busy opening their shops, I crossed the street and stepped across the threshold of scorched tile work. I was on my own for the time being. At least until the more adventurous tourists show up. The locals here were smart enough to respect Sal's for two things. First, that it was a crime scene, and you only wandered through it if you wanted to announce that you were involved. Second, that they considered this place a gravesite. Disturbing a grave, even in this magic-free realm, was considered an invitation to curses and bad luck. Still, there were those mob fans who wanted a piece of the action, a little memento of a true gangland crime. In Acryonis, we had a name for trophy-hunting dinks like this. Lycanthrope's Lunch. Suddenly, my eye caught sight of a tiny crater in the floor, next to the remnants of a bar. This must have been where an inconspicuous Italian pinstriped goblin left the bomb. With nothing like a storeroom underneath to take part of the blast, whomever sat around here got a full taste of Capone's wrath. Ouch. This bomb took most of the bar and the surrounding tables with it, Good bet that old Pretty Boy was somewhere in this vicinity. Yeah, Capone didn't care for anything on a small scale. He liked his hits like he liked his operas and his picture in the papers. Big and brash. I think his smile irked the feds more than anything else. It was one of those genuine F.O. smiles, letting them know they had nothing on them but speculation, circumstantial evidence, and J. Edgar Hoover breathing down their necks demanding results. Even if I were human-sized, I wouldn't have wanted to trade places with a Fed at this point. Too much overtime with very little hazard pay. I placed a hand into the hole created by the explosives, rubbing the dust and soot between my fingertips and giving the mix a few whiffs. Nothing new or out of the ordinary here. It was a standard Capone-style bomb, triggered by a timer that gave his man a chance to casually walk out of the establishment and then double-time it across the street. The bagman probably looked like an innocent jaywalker trying to avoid the traffic, so no one would notice him running from the scene, especially when the bomb blew. The stench of burnt wood still clung to the place, even after a week. From the faint traces of burnt flesh I was also picking up, it wouldn't have surprised me in the least if the coroners had overlooked a finger or toe in here somewhere. The sight of this place reminded me of orc raids that me and my boys would clean up after. Orcs didn't think a village was properly raided until everything, houses, barns, and the villagers themselves, weren't level with the ground. They called it efficiency. I called it a serious lack of self-control. I stepped over a small pile of timbers that had collapsed to make what resembled the skeleton of a tent. Just a glimpse of it brought back campaign memories. I smiled at the chance happening, but the smile quickly faded when I caught what was hidden behind it. Shooting another quick look to make sure I was enjoying the private time at a dead man's party, I bent down to sample the second crater. Sure enough, my fingers felt the unmistakable grit of black powder, and the sharp scent assailing my nostrils confirmed my conclusion. Like a broadsword into a troll's gut, it now started to sink in why this crime scene had struck me as particularly eerie. Usually in a mob hit involving a bomb, the building's front gets obliterated in the blast, leaving behind a gutted-out shell that serves as Capone's reminder to everyone, be it those closest to him or not yet part of the organization, that things are done his way. Period. It's important to have that reminder to the good people of Chicago, so lessons are not only learned, but stay learned. Teaching those lessons requires only one bomb. So this second crater was way out of the ordinary. 2 bombs for 1 hit? Capone liked his hits big, sure, but a few pounds of dynamite and a timer would have sent DeMaio the message. A second bomb, even for Alphonse, was too much of an orc's approach to things. Even the St. Valentine's Day massacre had a panache to it, brutal as it was. Unless this was something more than the standard hit. Had Pretty Boy been planning some kind of coup d'etat? I just love those French words, but they're a bitch to learn when you're working your way through a library. And Capone caught wind of it? Or was he pledging his allegiance elsewhere? Had Pretty Boy been thinking of changing his nickname to Stool Pigeon and turning state's evidence? Had he reached the decision that a retirement and old age suited him better than a dirt nap at the prime of his life? What could Capone's second-in-command, sitting pretty in the right hand of the big boss himself, have been up to that would merit this kind of drastic retaliation? Why? That is what my client wanted to know. Why was Capone's confidant in all matters suddenly and unceremoniously removed from his court via methods of extreme prejudice? This hit clearly wasn't intended to send a message or a warning. Capone had intended this hit to be the final solution to a problem. From the looks of this hit, the problem must have been a big one. Hearing the unwelcome sound of others' shoes against soot, I crouched lower behind the rubble and peered through cracks between blackened timbers to see exactly how many cops I had to contend with this morning. Well now, yet another surprise this morning for old Billy Baddins. The 2 guys belonging to the shoes contaminating the crime scene along with mine, were not cops. One of them was a real behemoth, chiseled jaw and all that. The other one was his doppelganger, but shorter, definitely the runt between the two of them. Couldn't hear a word they were saying, but guessed they weren't working for the mob because they weren't communicating with grunts, whistles, and clicks. The drab, off-the-rack suits that probably weighed as much as your basic leather armor were the second clue. When I noticed the duo making a beeline for the site of the first crater, my eyebrows went up. These guys knew exactly where to look for the location of that bomb, and they studied the soot and ash found there very closely, even giving it a few whiffs themselves. It didn't take an extraordinary honker like mine to get a hint of the kind of bomb used, but for humans, it took someone with the training and the talent. "Now what do you think you're doing?" came a brogue thick as potato soup from behind the two newcomers to my investigation. "This is what we here in Chicago call a crime scene. And unless you're wearing a badge, you're either a corpse or a con to be mulling about here. Better things in Chicago to do than disrespect the dead, don't you think?" Slower than keep slime, the two guys stood up from the crater, opened their coats with one hand, and withdrew their wallets with the other. As the suits opened their billfolds and did the ID routine, I took an opportunity to make my exit. Keeping low, which was easy for me, I stayed close to anything that would conceal my presence. Overturned tables, raised foundations, burned out booths, and so on. The cover that remained was enough for me to slip out of the ruins and into the now wide-open alleyway. From my new vantage point, it looked like the two bombs had done little surrounding damage. When I vigorously rubbed my fingers against the worn, blackened blocks of Sal's next-door neighbor and gave my stained skin a few whiffs, I picked up those signature scents that I knew Chicago for: engine exhaust, coal soot, standard city smells. After a good, strong exhale, I took a slightly deeper whiff. Yeah, I could detect minute traces of the blast, but I couldn't convince myself that this building had been even impolitely nudged by the two bombs. The new blast scent I was picking up was a lot stronger, but it wasn't coming from the alleyway. I returned to Sal's diner through what was left of the men's bathroom, daring to get caught. And there it was, just as my gut had told me it would be. Where the ladies' loo had once been, a third crater. The crunching of debris underfoot, much closer than it was before, reminded me my borrowed time was now gaining serious interest. It was that moment when a bard knows he's hit his final note for the evening, or when a jester drops that joke that kills. Know when to make your exit. If I didn't get out of there, and get out of there now, the cop would probably use something a lot nastier than a hook to haul my ass off this stage. That was no hit. What happened at Sal's diner made a wizard's maelstrom look like a spring drizzle. Hey, I was just joking when I said that in my office to Miss Lessinger. Still, my own words kept echoing in my head as I wiped my fingers with a hanky, making sure I was clean of any evidence. Now I was back in the alleyway and coming around the corner to Sal's non-existent storefront, where the cop and two suits were continuing their Saturday morning tea. Keeping my head down, my face concealed under the Stetson I was wearing, I took advantage of the angle to study Sal's sidewalk. While there were no real scorch marks projecting outward to indicate a blast, this sidewalk had not fared as well as that of Sal's neighbors. The damage implied this job was far from perfect. From the placement of the third crater, and if my hunch was right about possible other craters, Capone never intended to blow this place up. The big boss wanted to blow the diner down, effectively and efficiently, burying whomever happened to be there that morning. I lingered at the street corner, pretending to see if there was any oncoming traffic. It was still early in the morning, so traffic could barely be described as light. While the Flatfoot continued to act like a cheerful tour guide, the suits knew this for the tactic that it was, and their hushed conversation went dead on me. I crossed the street, then once again to the opposite corner, turning back to face the diner in ruins. This time, I was playing the part of a dwarf looking to hail a cab. By now, the cop's crusty demeanor had left for the Emerald Isle, and he couldn't have been more pleasant. Yeah, I guess the suits were cops after all, probably from another precinct. Chicago's finest were working together to put on a show for the commoners, but still nowhere closer in ridding the city of public enemy number one. Cute little show, but I enjoy the vaudeville at the State Theater a lot more. Halfway to the office, I slipped a cabbie a Lincoln and changed directions for the opposite side of town, towards Chicago City Hall and the courthouse. One of the big news stories of late was the commission for a new statue of Lady Justice to stand proudly in the center of the courthouse foyer, life-sized and elevated on a grand marble pedestal. Its completion had been slated for January, but January had come and gone. So had February. Now it looked like Miss Justice, along with some of the other improvements happening throughout City Hall and the courthouse, would be unveiled sometime in the late spring. No later than the early summer, the sculptor assured the Chicago Daily recently. The screws were beginning to tighten on the contractors, and no doubt a rack waited in the wings for Justice's artist. I guess those lawmakers were growing tired of the tarps and stepladders between their offices and courtrooms. Can't say I blame the suits too much on this one. Miranda had impressed me on the selling value of an image, and it's tough to sell the public through press conferences and photo opportunities when Chicago's legal hub appears to be a work in progress. With all these steps leading to a set of massive doors with ornate carvings, you would think Chicago's downtown courthouse housed the finest and most prestigious of the realm. In fact, the lowest of lowlifes, low enough to make a nest of trolls look like the Rockefellers, spend enough time in these hallowed halls to call it home, if but a second one. Of course, as it was the weekend, the courthouse was quiet, as well as locked up. Crime didn't take Saturday and Sunday off, mind you, but those who made the laws that got broken did. Peeking through the crack between the doors, I could make out the scaffolding, tarps covering the commemorative plaques and busts of judges and men of history, and other signs of work crews who were either off for the day or sleeping in late only to come in and continue work later. And I could make out a few pair of coveralls lying to one side of a ladder. It was easy to imagine those guys wearing their pinstripes underneath their coveralls, painting right up to quitting time and leaping out of their work clothes before the last stroke was dry. This was my stage. Let the play begin. Out of a fine leather pouch, I slid out a set of favorite tools from my realm. The small pick and its longer brother had been forged from a charmed metal that would not break under any stress, even if a marsh dragon tried to use one as a toothpick. When I acquired this little kit off a mercenary fighting on the wrong side of my battle axe, the other officers thought I'd come up on the short end of the quarterstaff. Then again, I didn't travel in the same circles as those privileged dinks. The buddies I traveled with from tavern to tavern took one glance at the pouch and knew I'd struck a motherlode of ore. Sure enough, a wizard passing through my village appraised the metal and the tools as being of magical origin. 3 words that a dwarf loves to hear. The first pick fit easily in the top notch of the lock, and searched for a latch to catch. Once I struck it, the second pick slid inside the lock until it hit the bolt. I casually walked away from the door for a moment, making certain I was in the clear. There was some weekend traffic on the street, but it was still too early for the tourists to be paying a visit. No beat cops in sight either, so I was all set to work my magic. The last tool was a larger, U-shaped piece of metal forged into the top of a small metal rod. I rapped it hard against the door, producing a small hum from the fork. A perfect pitch. The picks in the lock remained still until I placed the fork tongs on either side of them. The 2 slim rods now vibrated in a blanket of sound, and soon the picks moved on their own accord, searching for the grooves and bolts that a key would trigger. Suddenly, the top pick slid forward, while the lower turned slightly to an angle, and I heard the bolt in the courthouse's front door slide back with a loud thunk. I'm not crazy about magic, but it does come in handy now and then, especially when your specialty is infiltration and reconnaissance. My bread and butter in Acryonis, and now Chicago. 1 Hanselthrop, 2 Hanselthrop, 3 Hanselthrop, 4 Hanselthrop, 5 Hanselthrop. I whispered as I slipped through the massive doors. The alarm was sounding, and soon the weekend detail would wake up and find out who or what triggered the bells clanging in the main hallway. The only thing that could screw up this little plan of mine would be an eager beaver in his first day on the job. 8 Hasselthrop, 9 Hasselthrop, 10 Hasselthrop. I now had my coat off and was drowning in the smallest of the coveralls I found by a covered paint bucket and a set of wide brushes and rollers. Regardless of human's height, everything was big on me, but nothing that I couldn't solve by rolling up sleeves and pant legs. 16 Hasselthrop, 17 Hasselthrop, 18 Hasselthrop, 19 Hasselthrop, 20 Hasselthrop, 21. Yeah, here comes the infantry. I jammed a painter's cap on the back of my head and tossed my own fedora on top of my coat, now folded up next to the nearest stepladder. I even added the final touch of a paint can and brush in my hands by the time courthouse security, an older cop who was looking to make retirement by taking a job like this one instead of risking the beat walks, came tearing around the corner. I suppressed a smile on noticing the top buttons of his uniform and dress shirt were left open. Poor guy had been deep in the fairy's realm when the alarm went off. "What the hell, bub?" I barked. It was always good to come out of the box strong. Adds to the disorientation of the initial sight of me. "I was gonna say," he shouted, but then shook his head as he cast a wary glance to the alarm bell. "I was gonna ask you the same thing, shorty." "Weekend detail," I shouted back, but I didn't know if it was just me. But I had to wonder if those damn bells were getting louder. "I was told to be here this morning, 'cause we were going to finish up the second floor today. Door was unlocked, so I figured everyone was here. Guess I got here early." "What? You gotta hurry?" And now, the vaudeville routine. "Guess I got here early. Kinda small for a painter, ain't ya?" the cop shouted at me. "Save the wall for later? Okay, but that's gonna be hell to pay when we start on the ceilings without finishing the wall." "No, I said you're short for a painter." I shook my head. "Nah, we won't be short. There'll be a full crew on today. I'm just early." "No!" he screamed in desperation. "You short!" "Oh, yeah, I'm short. So are a lot of us on the Saturday crew. Why do you think we got so damn many ladders?" The security guard flung his hat on the ground and leaned in closer to me. "Have you got a work order? Fork over?" I asked, stretching up and turning my ear closer to him. I could hear him just fine, but I needed him to go away and stay away. No better way than to be left alone than to establish yourself as a severe pain in the ass. "Fork over what?" "A work order!" The poor sap was shouting so loud now that his voice was cracking. "I need to see the work order!" I placed a hand on his shoulder and leaned on him as I stood on my tippy toes. "I think my boss has it." "What?" "My boss!" Since I'm used to shouting orders over charging axemen, sounds of sword on shield, and goblin battle cries, my voice nearly knocked him off his feet. "My boss should have the work order on him." The bells were really starting to get to me now, so I knew his patience had to be wearing thinner than a wraith's wardrobe. He just nodded and pointed to the wide staircase at the end of the hall. "Offices are that way. Next time, back entrance." He was probably swearing up a storm over why he hadn't checked the courthouse doors at the end of the previous day. As I watched him disappear to shut off the alarm, I set down the paint and brush for a moment so I could grab my memo pad and lockpicks. I was about halfway up the steps to the second floor when the sounds of the bells ceased, replaced by the scuff, scuff, scuff of my own feet ascending the stairs. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you enjoyed the show. I'll be here all week. I climbed up to the 7th floor, where I knew the more important lawyer types congregated. District attorneys, assistant DAs, and the rest of their lot. I figured these were the guys who were keeping tabs, or at least trying to, on thugs like Pretty Boy DeMaio. Apart from the feds itching to prosecute Capone for his various criminal activities, the DA's office would love to score one up on the Treasury Department. Locally, it would easily make anyone's career in politics, if it were the local law enforcement that brought Capone down. On a national level, it would attract a lot more attention, and alongside that, commerce to the greater Chicago area. And hey, If you wanted to leave Chicago for greener moors and cleaner shires, you could write your own ticket if you could boast how instrumental you were in taking down the big boss. My enchanted picks barely broke a sweat with the assistant DA's office. I slowly poked my head around the doorway, because you never know if an assistant DA would be burning twilight torches in order to come across that one all-important clue leading to Capone. This Saturday morning, no one was home. The office was kept immaculate, a very good sign that I was in for a quick visit. Setting down the paint can and brush, I set to work finding out what I would need in this office. Height. There are certain constants in this new realm to which I have grown accustomed, and now I'm reaching a point where I appreciate them. I can always rely on hot dogs in Wrigley Field tasting a lot better than the dogs I get in Grant Park. I can always count on the news in the Herald Examiner to be less biased than that of the Defender. I know that politicians, be they local or higher up in the congressional pecking order, will promise to make everything better while they're actually trying to make things worse for their successors. And I also know that humans who work in offices believe themselves to be in such a hurry that they need wheels in their chairs to shave off those all-important seconds between sliding away from a desk and getting on their feet. The whole concept of a chair with wheels on it initially struck me as not only hysterical, but just a hint pretentious. Come on, you can't just get a normal chair, scoot up to a table, and conduct your business like anyone else? Does one truly believe the time saved between gliding away from a desk and planting your feet on terra firma is that crucial in getting things done? It really took a lot for me not to laugh at these humans in their wagon thrones, as I had called them from my hiding places in the library. Of course, when I had gone shopping for office furniture, there wasn't a lot of dwarf-sized furniture around, and it was pretty disappointing to find out how miniature furniture truly was. That was when I realized that the carpenters of Acryonis who specialized in scrap furniture were pretty skilled at what they did, regardless of what they called their wares made dwarves flinch. So I swallowed my pride and bought my own office chair. And I love it. I not only get height, but I get a lot of mobility. This guy apparently liked his chair with a lot of swivel, so I had to adjust to its give. I climbed into the seat and pushed against the desk, rolling over to one of the file cabinets. I opened up the top drawer and started scanning through the A's, hoping that the assistant DA's filing system was as neat and pristine as his office. The top drawer was continuing into the C's, so this was a strikeout. I pushed back from the filing cabinet to give me enough room to go down into the D's, one drawer down. Still nothing. And when I was in the C's, there wasn't even a file on Capone. Was I not looking in the right place? Should I be checking M for Mafia? Or Mobster? Would I need to check under I for Italians? I removed the painter's cap and scratched my noggin, trying to itch the answer out of my brain. You don't walk into an office as clean and organized as this and have to struggle to find something. I could tell from the absence of an old newspaper and the lack of clutter on his desk that there was no room for anything out of order. The easier it was for him to find, the happier he was, and the more he could accomplish. I knew whatever I was missing was staring me in the face. Then I realized I was staring at the assistant DA's desk. Considering the current state of Chicago, would I really keep Mafia files on the other side of my office or within arm's reach? I hopped down from the chair and waddled over to this fine mahogany keep, taking a closer look at how well this thing was put together. Considering the obvious craftsmanship that went into creating this monstrosity, I had to wonder what the district attorney's desk looked like. It must take up one wall and continue down another. The top drawer opened with no effort, and its contents were as neat as a new blade, back from the forge and sharpened to a fine edge. Pencils were grouped with pencils. Erasers were grouped with erasers. Yeah, this assistant DA redefined the term particular. There were 3 small drawers on the left hand and 2 drawers on the right. The top right drawer, which was smaller, kept memo pads of various sizes. It was the most cluttered area of this office, as smaller pads slipped freely over the larger, legal-sized notebooks. It would have come as no shock to me if he had partitioned the top drawer to remedy this. Maybe that was his weekend project. The larger drawer was locked. Oh, the search and infiltration memories this drawer brought back. Journeying down stone corridor after stone corridor, All doors unlocked or open. And then there was that last one at the end of the corridor. Locked. Usually there was something mighty fine waiting for us on the other side of that door. Although there was that one time when the locked door was actually a nursery of new-bred orcs. Yeah, that was a rough night. Applying the picks to the smaller lock proved a challenge, but I managed to find the necessary grooves needed to trigger it. I rapped the fork against the floor, not wanting to take any chances in scratching the oak of the desk, and passed the tongs on either side of the picks. The silver instruments vibrated lightly, and then... nothing. The instruments stopped suddenly, and the drawer lock remained engaged. I gave the fork a much harder knock against the floor. Once in the cradle of charmed sound, these picks were working overtime. Let me put it another way. These metallic locksmiths were either trying to solve this puzzle of latches and levers, or knitting a sweater inside that keyhole. I rapped the fork on the floor again, evoking an even stronger sound from its prongs. As the tone grew, the picks began to vibrate violently, and then glow. The longer they shook in the lock, the more the pick's light blue glow turned bright white. The glass panes of the office windows shuddered lightly, and the symphony of tinkling from the plaques, law degrees, and various other honors hanging on the walls and sitting on the bookshelves swelled louder and louder, reaching a level of sound that I was sure would attract the attention of that overnight wonder of a guard. I gritted my teeth hard to keep them from chattering as the magic I generated turned more ferocious. The picks were now bright as a pure white, prolonged flash of sunlight catching polished silver, so bright that I could no longer look directly at it. I heard two of the assistant DA's honors shatter, along with a vase of wilting flowers at the right corner of the desk. Then I heard a sharp crack, and the tone of my fork, shuddering of window panes, and dinging of glassware faded together, much like the tunes of court musicians ending with a decrescendo that leaves only a moment of silence before the nobles' applause. The concert of sorcery was over. I almost broke out into applause myself, but I was still too busy catching my breath, wiping away the cold sweat from my brow, dabbing my lips on the cuff of those baggy coveralls. The only sound in the office now was a steady drip, drip, drip of foul-smelling water from the vase, now partially covering the desk. Wisps of thick, pearly smoke slipped off my picks. Placing a hand on the drawer handle and closing my peepers, I whispered a quick prayer to the guardians as I gave a gentle pull. The drawer slid closer to me, and I gave a heavy sigh of relief. I dodged a throwing dagger on this one, I thought as I looked on the treasure waiting for me. They were all here. Alphonse Scarface Capone, Anthony Prettyboy DeMaio, Frank the Enforcer Nitti, Rio, McGurn. It was dossier after dossier of the organization, many of them incomplete and only a sacred few with red tabs marking their folders. No doubt, those marked folders indicated the ones who were somewhere in the big house. I pulled out the DeMaio folder and started flipping through the various clippings and pictures of Capone's showy second-in-command. It looked like DeMaio loved the ladies, and he loved the lifestyle. I paused at the sight of one picture where he had his arm around my client's waist, as she offered up a polite smile for the camera. Tony was obviously captured in a moment of true hilarity, because his mouth was open so wide that a marsh bat could fly in, remove his tonsils, and fly out without catching the roof of his mouth. He had Julia Lessinger in one hand, and a smoldering stogie wedged between the index and middle finger of the other. Surrounding him were a variety of mob types, including an inside contact of mine that I was needing to get a hold of, and a few of Julie's types, rich, good girls sampling the wildlife. Yeah, life was good to Tony. Damn shame life couldn't remain so kind to him. Julia's expression gave me a slight chill because of its complete detachment from the raucous setting. The people around Tony were definitely putting on a better act than she was. Or maybe Tony was, in fact, that funny of a guy. Maybe he was the life of the party, and Julia preferred to put on the airs of high society for this moment captured by Eastman Kodak. Or maybe she knew what he really was at his core. In my world, the minor nobility ranks, countesses, viscountesses, barons, and especially knights, really enjoyed the privileges and prestige of their titles, but they were appointed their titles. You can dress an ogre in the finest silks of the Hun-Shi dynasty, adorn them with the finest jewels from the mines of Griffinos, encase their feet in the softest, most supple leather of the elvish tanneries, and bestow upon it the title of Lord Constable of the Realm. But that doesn't change what you've dressed up in your Sunday best. That ogre, bathed, dressed, and titled, is still an ogre, and will tear out your throat so it can gnaw on your trachea. Same thing can be said for minor nobility. A peckerwood with a title. That was the look Julia Lessinger had in this photo. The look of a princess in the company of Baron Peckerwood. I continued through the file's contents. Not so much as a marked check or star to hint that DeMaio was caught with his hand in the cookie jar and singing to the DA's office or Uncle Sam, so he could keep feeding his late-night social habits. I had to give the DA's office credit. They were trying to catch the same big tuna that kept eluding the feds' lures, hoping for a moment when they would be there and the feds would not. You would think that Capone would sweat being tailed by both the feds and the local cops. And he would sweat it too, if they were working together. Capone probably figured out he could count on the healthy competition between state law enforcement and J. Edgar's boys. And as the G-men and cops tripped over one another trying to trip up Capone, Capone sidestepped the law and ran his business, much to the chagrin of honest folks. And that was the end of the file. Nothing. According to what was in my pudgy little hands, the DA's office knew DeMaio was part of the business, but lacked any hard evidence that could persuade him to turn on his big boss. Of course, finding a witness willing to step forward against anyone in Capone's organization was about as likely as finding a survivor from a goblin bachelor party. I returned the file to its rightful place among the lower dregs of Chicago society, removed the pics from the drawer's keyhole, and it slid shut. The instruments were still warm, their heat just seeping through the leather pouch. Suddenly, my hand whipped back on feeling a sharp sting of electricity from the drawer's keyhole. I must have brushed against it while keeping an eye on the door for any visitors curious about the earlier noise I was making. My hand tingled lightly, and I gave a small, spiteful laugh as I rubbed it. The lock's bolt sliding into place seemed a lot louder than it should have been, but I chalked that up to my nerves playing tricks on me. I carefully stepped through the puddle formed at the corner of the desk, wiping my shoes clean on the modest office rug before returning to the hallway. I could hear a commotion downstairs growing. The weekend shift was arriving. I came back down the steps at a quick pace, unheard by the workmen who were lining up lunchboxes. 2 guys were trying to talk in hushed voices about being stuck on the Saturday shift, but I could hear every word. Safe to assume the supervisor hadn't arrived yet. The chatter came to a halt at the sight of me, and I clearly heard, "What the hell is that?" and "Is the circus in town?" followed by a few chuckles from the other 3 in the crew. "You know something, pal?" I began, pointing a finger at the circus comment clown. "If the circus was in town, I'd give you the sound advice to ask if there was a job opening for mucking out the elephant's car. You're going to find yourself shoveling shit if you don't make some progress on this lobby pronto." One of these Rembrandt flunkies, still buttoning up his coveralls, didn't bother to look at me as he asked, "And just who are you, Shorty, to be barking at us like some kind of mutt?" "I'm the mutt that'll piss on your leg and tell you it's raining if you don't drop the attitude. Now, if you want to keep your job, send a crew upstairs to the 7th floor. Some dink left the assistant DA's office a mess." "7th floor?" Another worker, the what-the-hell guy, piped in. "We haven't even finished the 2nd. "Doesn't matter who made the mess," I snapped back. "You know how these bureaucrats are. They are elected royalty. If there's anything wrong with their offices, it'll be our fault, so clean it up. Now, I want 3 people here and 2 on the 2nd floor. I'm going to call in the 2nd team." "Jesus, already that far behind." It's amazing how much bigger I look when I rest my fists on my hips. Letting out a heavy sigh, I looked up to the ceiling as if I was about to blow my top. This was my little one-man show, and I wasn't going to disappoint. All I know is I got the phone call this morning to be here, do the walkthrough, and let you dinks know where we stood. Now it's our asses if we don't gain some ground with this job, so get going. I grabbed my coat and switched the painter's cap for my fedora. "I'll be right back. Call in that 2nd team." Halfway down the steps, I saw a mousy excuse of a human pass me, casting a nervous glance at first, but then staring at my coveralls. He was probably thinking, "Those look like mine," but then dismissed the thought, figuring I was way too short to fit into anything of his. He must have missed the rolled-up cuffs or sleeves. Too bad I had to leave so soon. I would have loved to hear him say, "Anyone see my cover?" Hey, wait a minute. A few minutes later, the coveralls were bunched up in the floorboards of the cab that I caught a block away. I was back in the preferred fit of my coat, my hand still tingling a bit from what happened in the assistant DA's office. The last time I saw something like that glass-shattering sideshow, it was deep in the musty darkness of a labyrinth back in Acryonis, when I was working with a rather tricky lock. My boys and I watched as my charmed instruments took on a glow, vibrated inside the keyhole, and then came to a rest. When I rapped the fork harder against the stone wall of the maze, like I had just done in the office, some of us shielded our eyes at the light generated from my picks. That was when our mage in residence. It was always a good idea to travel with some kind of sorcerer when breaking into an enemy stronghold, especially if that enemy was suspected of allying themselves with necromancers. Gave us the bad news that we were not going through this door anytime soon. There was some serious magic in place, broken only by equally powerful magic. Magic we didn't possess. The buildings of Chicago passed by me, but I was paying less attention to the city and more to the people, now awake and roaming the sidewalks. Someone out there, someone working for the Chicago DA's office, was casting spells on office furniture. Not particularly powerful magic, but enough to discourage any humans from trying to pick the lock of a particular desk. Much like Acryonis, Chicago was a town of surprises and secrets, and this secret was a doozy. It had been a long time since I'd gotten this homesick. Spellcasters in 1929 Chicago. Just when you think you've seen it all in this town.